Hey friends, welcome to Unpolished but Called. I'm Kathrin Shaffer, and today might be a little heavier. I know it's Monday, but it's not in an everything falling apart way, but more like in a whisper, the kind you don't always notice right away. Because nothing feels wrong, life is still going, routines are still in place, things look normal on the outside. But something underneath has changed, and it's subtle enough that it's easy to ignore. It's that place where something that used to bother us doesn't anymore. Something we used to wrestle with, think about, maybe even feel convicted over, now just kind of sits there without much reaction. Not because we've grown past it or because we've overcome it, but because we've gotten used to it. And that's a different thing entirely. Because growth and numbness can look similar on the surface if we're not paying attention. One feels like peace, the other feels like nothing. And if we're not careful, we can mistake the absence of tension for the presence of maturity, when in reality, we've just stopped noticing something that used to matter. And that's not always obvious while it's happening. It doesn't show up as rebellion, doesn't feel like we're walking away from God. It just feels like we're not as bothered as we used to be. And in a weird way, that can feel like progress because it's easier. There's less internal friction, less back and forth in our mind. That's uncomfortable feeling that used to make us stop and reconsider. But easier doesn't always mean better, as we know. Sometimes it just means we've adjusted to something that used to get our attention. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Not in a condemning way, not for Monday, or in a you should feel bad kind of tone, but honestly. Because if we don't talk about this kind of thing, it's really easy to drift into it without realizing what's actually happening. So there's a strange kind of movement that happens over time, and it's not loud enough to grab our attention, which is probably why it works as well as it does. It doesn't show up as a big decision or some clear turning point where we can look back and say, that's where things changed. It shows up in small ways, in moments that feel ordinary enough to ignore, and because they don't interrupt our life in an obvious way, they slowly become part of it. What used to feel off begins to feel familiar, and what once caught our attention doesn't hit the same way anymore. It's not that we sat down one day and decided to stop caring. It's that we stopped noticing how much we were adjusting. At first, the change can feel like relief more than anything else. There's less internal tension, less of that back and forth in our mind where we're weighing something out or feeling that quiet nudge that makes us stop and reconsider. Things feel smoother. We don't feel as conflicted. And if we've spent a lot of time wrestling with something, that shift can feel like progress. Like maybe we've matured, grown past it. Maybe God has just taken that struggle away and we're finally on the other side of it. But here's where it gets a little uncomfortable if we sit with it long enough. Not everything that feels like peace is actually peace. Sometimes it's just quiet. And quiet can mean a lot of things. It can mean rest, or it can mean we've stopped listening. It can mean clarity, or it can mean we've stopped paying attention to something that used to matter. And the hard part is, those two things can feel almost identical in the moment if we're not slowing down enough to ask what's actually going on underneath it. Because real peace, the kind that comes from God, doesn't disconnect us from awareness. It doesn't make us less sensitive to what's right or wrong. It doesn't numb us out to everything that just feels natural or neutral. The peace Jesus gives has a steadiness to it, but it still keeps us aligned, responsive. It still keeps us aware of what we're doing and why we're doing it. It settles us without dulling us. So what we're talking about here is different. This is when something that used to catch our attention just doesn't anymore. Not because we've resolved it or that we've brought it to God and worked through it, but because we've been around it long enough that it doesn't feel out of place anymore. It blends in. It becomes part of our normal, and once something becomes normal, it's very easy to stop questioning it. And that's how it happens. Not in one big moment, but in a series of small ones where we let something slide, and then let it slide again, and then stop thinking about it altogether. We tell ourselves it's not that serious, or that we'll deal with it later, or that we're overthinking it. And those thoughts feel reasonable in the moment. They don't feel like compromise. They feel like balance, like we're just not being too hard on ourselves. But over time, that it's not that big of a deal mindset starts to reshape what we even recognize as a deal at all. And that's where scripture starts to hit a little differently. Because when the Bible talks about a conscience becoming seared, like in 1 Timothy 4:2, it's not describing someone who woke up one day and decided to walk away from God entirely. It's describing what happens when something is ignored often enough that it stops registering. The sensitivity fades. Not because the standard changed, but because our response to it did. And that's a process, a slow one. That kind of doesn't announce itself while it's happening. Which is why it's so easy to miss. Because from the outside, nothing looks extreme. We're still showing up. We're still doing life. We're still believing in God. We still identify as someone who follows Jesus. There's no dramatic break that signals something has gone wrong. If anything, things feel a little easier than they used to. And that's exactly why it's so deceptive. Because ease can be mistaken for growth. And sometimes it's just the absence of resistance. And those are not the same thing. Following Jesus doesn't always feel easier in the sense that everything becomes effortless. There's still awareness, still conviction, still that internal check that brings us back when we start drifting. It's not constant heaviness, but it is consistent alignment. There's a responsiveness to God that remains intact. When that starts to fade, it's worth paying attention to. Not in a panic or something is terribly wrong kind of way, but in an honest way where we're willing to look at what's going on without brushing it off too quickly. Because if we don't stop and notice it, it's very easy to keep moving forward, assuming everything is fine, simply because nothing feels uncomfortable anymore. And that's the part we don't always catch. We assume discomfort is the problem, when sometimes it was actually the signal. And this is where it's important to slow down before we turn this into something heavier than it needs to be. Because if we're not careful, a conversation like this can start to sound like, well, if you don't feel convicted, something must be wrong. And that's not the heart of what we're talking about. The goal isn't to create anxiety or make us question every quiet moment in our life. The goal is awareness, not pressure. Because once we can recognize what's actually happening, we're in a much better place to respond to it in a healthy way instead of ignoring it or overreacting to it. Because here's the part we can't miss. God does not step back just because we've gone quiet. Jesus doesn't withdraw the moment our awareness dulls a bit. He's not standing at a distance waiting for us to figure it out on our own. If anything, his pursuit becomes more intentional in ways we don't always expect. Not louder necessarily, but more specific, precise, personal. And it doesn't always show up in the way we would choose. It might come through a moment where something finally catches our attention again, and we can't quite shake it. A conversation we didn't plan on having that lands a little too close to home. A passage of scripture that suddenly feels less like something we're reading and more like something that's reading us. A quiet awareness that something we've been brushing off isn't sitting right anymore. And that's not random or coincidence. That's God getting our attention in a way that still leaves room for us to respond. Because He doesn't force us. And that's what makes this both incredibly gracious and a little uncomfortable at the same time. He will call us back, but He won't drag us back. He will bring things to light, but He won't override our ability to ignore it if we choose to. And that tension is where we actually get to decide what we're going to do with it. Because once something becomes clear again, even if it's just a small awareness, we can't pretend we don't see it. We might not like it. We might not want to deal with it right away. We might be tempted to push it off again. But there's a difference between not noticing something and choosing to ignore it once it's been brought back into focus. And that's where grace shows up in a way we don't always expect. Not as permission to stay where we are, but as an invitation to come back without shame. Because if we're blunt, the moment we realize we've been a little numb, our instinct is usually not to run toward God, it's to hesitate. There's that quick internal reaction that says, oh, I should have caught this earlier. Or I should be further along than this. Oh, I knew better. And those thoughts can make us pull back instead of leaning in, because now it feels like we have to fix something before we come back. But friends, that's not how this works. Jesus doesn't wait for us to clean it up before we return. He meets us in the awareness itself, right there, in that moment where something clicks again, and we realize we've been a little off, disconnected, a little too comfortable with something that used to matter more. That moment isn't the end of something. It's the beginning of coming back into alignment. And that's the part that keeps us from becoming heavy in the wrong way. Because this isn't about condemnation. It's about correction. And those two things feel very different when you actually experience them. Condemnation pushes us away. Correction draws us back. Condemnation tells us we failed. Correction reminds us we're not finished. And when God corrects, it's never disconnected from His grace. It's never about shaming us into change. It's about restoring awareness so we can step back into what's actually good for us, even if it means facing something we've been avoiding. That's why numbness isn't the end of the story. It's just a place we pass through if we're willing to be honest about it. Because the same God who allowed us to feel conviction in the first place is still present when that conviction fades. He hasn't changed. His truth hasn't shifted. His desire for us hasn't lessened. What changes is our awareness. And when that awareness comes back, even quietly, it's an invitation. Not to panic or spiral, just to respond. And responding doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as acknowledging it, bringing it back to God instead of pushing it aside again. Letting that awareness lead us back into alignment instead of talking ourselves out of it. And that's it. No wild overhaul required. No need to turn it into a whole production. Just a return. Because that's what following Jesus actually looks like most of the time. Not perfection or constant intensity. Just returning again and again whenever we realize we've drifted, even slightly. And the more we practice that, the easier it becomes to recognize the difference between peace and numbness, between growth and desensitization, between something being resolved and something just being ignored. That awareness doesn't make us perfect, but it does keep us responsive. And that responsiveness is what keeps us close. So friends, this is one of those conversations that doesn't really need a big ending. Because it's not about landing on a perfect takeaway. It's about noticing something we might have missed and being willing to sit with it honestly for a minute. Because if we're all honest, we've all been in that place at some point where something used to matter more and then it did. Not because we walked away from God, but because we slowly adjusted to something without realizing it. And the good news in all of that is that God doesn't leave us there. He's still present, still speaking, drawing us back, even if it's in quiet ways that don't always feel dramatic. So if something in this conversation stood out to you, don't rush past it. You don't have to fix everything today. Just don't ignore it. Everything connected to what we're building here, including the Start Here guide and the rest of the ecosystem, is in the show notes if you want to go a little deeper in your faith. Thanks for sitting in this conversation with me, and we'll talk again soon.